you research Syriac fathers. What are their place among many, many fathers that lived in Byzantine, in Rome? What the place of these fathers, Syriac fathers?
Well, I like to see Christian tradition as having not just Greek East, Latin West, which is how most people see it, but having three different elements. And the third would be what I call the Syriac Orient. And each of these traditions has its own particular quality or emphasis, which the others don't always have. And so each particular emphasis in each of these three traditions is of value to all the others. And that's why I think the Syriac tradition is particularly important. I mean, if you can put it in very simplistic terms, the Latin tradition is very good on the legal side, the canon law side, the Greek tradition on the more philosophical side, and I would say the Syriac tradition is much more on the symbolic and especially the poetic side. Of course, you find in Greek and Latin poetry wonderful things which are equally fine, but I think as it were, the predominance of poetry as a vehicle for theology is something that the Syriac tradition, especially with St. Ephrem, who beside being a first-class poet, is also a really important theologian. And it's that aspect that I think is absent from or forgotten in the other traditions, that theology can be expressed in poetry just as validly as in prose.
Can you tell us briefly about the difference between Byzantine Christology, Orthodox Christology, and modern Syriac Christology or Orient Christology?
Well, as Syriac Christology, there's no single tradition. Really, one could say that it's historically the case that the Syriac tradition has three different, or it's a transmitter of three different Christological traditions. The Chalcedonian tradition, which of course is the same as the Byzantine tradition, and until the 17th century, Syriac was one of the languages of the Chalcedonian Patriarchate of Antioch, and that's often forgotten. So Syriac has a Chalcedonian tradition, but then you have the East tradition of the Church of the East and the tradition of the Syrian Orthodox and the other Oriental Orthodox churches. And simply because I've had to read texts from all these three traditions, I have, I suppose, what you could say the privilege of realizing that once you get underneath what they say on the surface and the verbal conflict, two nature, one nature, and so on, they are all trying to express the same thing, but with different starting points. Each tradition is afraid of one particular heretical position and so reacts in a certain way. And also in a particular, well, one could say they belong to a particular theological understanding of certain terms, and in particular term hypostasis and physis. These are terms which are clearly understood in different ways, and once you realize this, you can see how the conflict has arisen and also how it should be resolved, and indeed has been resolved by theologians in modern dialogue, but unfortunately that hasn't as it were gone further, because when you solve the theological problems you find that the ecclesiological problems but as I see it, basically the Christological problems and the differences are soluble and indeed have been solved in modern dialogue.
Where in the world maybe a student, a researcher can get the best education, the best experience of studying Syriac fathers?
That's a difficult question, and at any one point it may be different. At the moment, here's my chauvinism. I would say Oxford is a very good place, not because I'm here, but because my successor, David Taylor, is very good, and he was one of my best students. And he has very wide knowledge, he's a very good scholar, he's very open, and I think he will go far. In a way, the trouble is, in Western academic world is in such a difficult position at the moment in the humanities. There's great uncertainty, and whole universities don't know what's going to happen to the humanities. In this country, it's, if you ask the Vice-Chancellor, he says, we don't know. We should be, the government should tell us what they're going to do. We don't know. And so everything is uncertain. So it's a matter of finding where there are good people, sympathetic people at a particular time. France is quite strong at the moment, Italy is quite strong at the moment in certain places, Holland, but different people have different aspects of interest. So it's a matter of exploring to find where is the best. But what I can say is that Oxford has the only taught master's course in Syriac studies, and I started this off about 20 years ago and found it extremely useful for getting people really into the subject. We have very intensive reading throughout the year. There's no thesis but 4 exam papers with essays, so you get at least I hope people get a good basic knowledge of the tradition so that they can move on to do research in one particular field that they, or author that they choose for. Because there are very few places where you can study Syriac as an undergraduate, and it's always as a subsidiary subject, so you're doing it with other things. This course, this MA course, Master's Studies in Syriac Studies, it's unique outside India. India has, in Kerala, there's a good place. It's much cheaper than Oxford, but the standard isn't, of course, quite the same. But that is another possibility. They have good classes, good people, good library. The St. Ephrem Ecumenical Research Institute in Kottayam in Kerala. So these are the only 2 places in the world at the moment that have Syriac at a not at an elementary level.
What can researching of Syriac fathers give to modern Orthodox researcher?
I would put it in 2 ways. Personally, the 2 great Syriac writers that I have learned so much from, one is St. Ephrem, whom I've mentioned, the poet of the 4th century. His theology is, I think, very meaningful for modern humanity. He's very ecological in his approach to the relationship between humanity and the world, and that's obviously something very important. But he sees it not just on a physical basis of the physical world, it's also he sees the essential as an essential link between humanity and the spiritual ecosphere, one could say. And then the other great Syriac writer whom I've learned a great deal from is St. Isaac the Syrian, St. Isaac of Nineveh. So he's a totally different writer from the monastic tradition. And of course he got into Greek quite early on, so he has influenced the Byzantine tradition very profoundly, and of course is widely read today. Now what seems to, as a way, separate Isaac out from at least many Greek Byzantine monastic writers is that he's writing in a tradition that's not, well, this is too strong a word, not fettered by the Greek rhetorical tradition. So he's writing much more, as it were, from a biblical style. even though you will find that Isaac, I mean, if you compare him to the Septuagint, it's very different. But what I'm trying to say is that his approach and the way he puts things is much more, should we say, pictorial in a way. And he works by images rather than concepts. And the images, as it were, are vehicles for concepts. And I think that's something that's very much present in Ephraim too. But I would say this applies to both of them.
Nowadays we can see something like a resurrection of patristic studies in Russia.
Yes.
What can you wish to our researchers, what mistakes they should avoid on their ways?
That's a difficult question.
From your experience.
I think it's very important to let the Church Fathers speak to the researchers and to us today, rather than imposing what we think they should say. That's the first most important thing. It's a responsibility that we have to them. They can't answer back and say that you're wrong or we are wrong. So that, I think, is one of the most important things. I think such a lot is written about the Church Fathers today in the West. I would say that it's perhaps more important to read the Church Fathers than to read the secondary literature, and be selective in what you read of the secondary literature. Some of it's extremely good, some of it's very illuminating, but one can be bogged down, one can be drowned by it. There's so much of it. Another thing I think would, and this is a great opportunity, there are a lot of important texts which are unpublished. Here's a wonderful chance for make them available. And also very important is to make these texts available to ordinary people. It's not something just for scholars. And what I think is one of the wonderful things that St. Vladimir's Seminary Press does, they have this popular patristic series. These are accessible translations with introductions that aren't too technical. They give the essential information and, as it were, act as a bridge from today to the ancient writers. And I think this is a very important role for all academics who work on patristics, because these are not, as it were, private ancient documents just for us. They're for everyone, and maybe in the form of anthologies or translations of single works. It's a matter of choosing things that are going to speak to a much wider public, and there are plenty of things. So that, I think, would be what I'd suggest.
Thank you.
Well, not at all. Thank you.